In the heart of Israel, a profound silence had fallen, a quiet so deep it mimicked the stillness of death. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, parched and weary under a sky of burnished brass that offered no promise of relief. The familiar melody of raindrops on hardened earth had become a forgotten hymn, replaced by the grating whisper of wind across brittle fields and the mournful cracking of the dry riverbeds of Cherith and Kishon. This was not merely a meteorological event, it was a physical manifestation of a deeper, more corrosive, spiritual drought. The laughter of children playing in the village squares had faded, their energy sapped by the relentless sun and the gnawing scarcity. The very air, thick with dust and despair, carried the stench of decay, a tangible symbol of a nation that had forsaken its living water for broken cisterns. The soul of Israel was as barren as its soil. From the gilded halls of Samaria, the nation's spiritual affliction was cultivated and exported. Here, King Ahab, a ruler adrift on a sea of moral compromise, and his queen, the Phoenician Jezebel, presided over a court of calculated decadence. They had engineered a grotesque union, attempting to weave the worship of the one true God, Yahweh, with the hedonistic and cruel rites of Baal. The capital was a theater of syncretism, where the sacred name was spoken in halls adorned with idols, and the people were encouraged to limp between two faiths, never fully committing to either. This spiritual schizophrenia had poisoned the national identity, creating a vacuum of conviction that Jezebel eagerly filled with her pantheon of foreign gods. The court, with its sophisticated rituals and lavish ceremonies, offered a religion of convenience and spectacle, a stark, damning contrast to the parched, desperate reality of the common people. Into this world of gilded decay and desperate thirst walked a man who seemed to be the very antithesis of his time. He was not a product of the Levitical schools or a court-appointed seer. He was Elijah of Tishbe, a figure carved from the untamed wilderness of Gilead, a place of rugged mountains and deep ravines. Dressed not in the fine linens of the palace, but in a simple garment of camel's hair and a leather belt. He was a man whose presence was as jarring and untamed as the landscape that had shaped him. His authority was not derived from social standing or royal favor, but was forged in the crucible of solitude, in the profound silence of the desert where the voice of God thunders most clearly. He was a walking, breathing relic of a purer faith, a solitary witness sent from the margins to confront the corrupted center of power. His arrival was not announced by heralds or preceded by diplomatic overtures. He simply appeared, a phantom of the wilderness, materializing in the very heart of temporal power, standing before King Ahab himself. The air in the throne room, usually thick with the scent of incense and political intrigue, grew still as this rugged man fixed his gaze upon the king. There was no tremor in his voice, only the unyielding weight of divine authority as he delivered a verdict, not a warning. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives whom I serve," he declared, "there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." The sentence hung in the air, a direct declaration of war, not from a rival kingdom, but from the forgotten king of creation. If this story of a man standing alone against a nation already resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments from which city you are watching this journey unfold. The divine command that followed Elijah's audacious pronouncement was not one of continued public confrontation, but of strategic, silent withdrawal. The voice of God, which had propelled him into the king's court, now led him back into the desolate embrace of the wilderness. He was instructed to go eastward and hide himself by the brook Cherith, a secluded ravine that would become both his sanctuary and his classroom. Here, the thundering prophet was to become a quiet recluse, his world shrinking to the confines of a rocky gorge and the sound of a dwindling stream. In this profound isolation, God dismantled the prophet's self-reliance, teaching him a radical dependence. His sustenance would come not from human hands or cultivated fields, but from the beaks of ravens, creatures considered unclean, a humbling and miraculous provision that underscored the divine source of his strength. The world he had just defied was forgotten. His only task was to listen, to wait, and to drink from the brook, learning that the power to command the heavens is first nurtured in the discipline of absolute obedience and trust in the lonely places. While Elijah was being schooled in the art of divine reliance, the kingdom he had cursed was descending into a frenzy of rage and retaliation. Spearheaded by the formidable Queen Jezebel, she was more than a queen. She was a high priestess of Baal worship, the iron will behind Ahab's pliable conscience. Elijah's prophecy was not merely an inconvenience, it was a direct assault on the authority of her gods and, by extension, her own power. In her eyes, he was not a messenger of God, but an agent of chaos, a political insurgent threatening the very fabric of her syncretic state. A furious manhunt was unleashed, a systematic purge to silence the voice of Yahweh by slaughtering his prophets. The confrontation was now sharply defined. It was the stark, solitary faith of a man hidden by a stream against the monolithic, murderous apparatus of a state religion. The tension was palpable. Elijah's God had shut the heavens, and Jezebel's response was to drench the earth in the blood of those who served him, setting the stage for a conflict that would determine the soul of Israel. After 3.5 years of divine seclusion and silent preparation, the word of the Lord came to Elijah once more, not in a whisper by a dwindling brook, but as a command to march back into the heart of the crisis. He emerged from the wilderness a changed man, his features etched by solitude and his spirit honed by a singular focus on God's will. The land he re-entered was a ghost of the nation he had left, a landscape of profound suffering, where the dust of forgotten abundance coated every surface. The famine had carved its signature into the hollowed faces of the people and the skeletal frames of their livestock. It was in this desolate setting that he encountered Obadiah, a righteous man secretly preserving God's prophets in the very palace of Ahab. The contrast was stark. From a life of total dependence on God in the wild to a direct confrontation with the political and spiritual powers that had ravaged the nation. The time for waiting was over. The hour for a public verdict had arrived. The inevitable reunion with King Ahab crackled with years of suppressed fury. Upon seeing the prophet, the king's first words were not of concern for his starving people, but of venomous accusation. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Ahab, blinded by his own culpability, saw Elijah not as a messenger of divine judgment, but as the source of his nation's misery. With the unshakable calm of one who speaks for a higher throne, Elijah reversed the charge, his voice cutting through the king's blustering rage. "I have not made trouble for Israel," he declared, "but you and your father's family have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." The prophet did not just deflect the blame, he exposed its root, and then, seizing the divine initiative, he issued a challenge that would force a definitive choice. He commanded Ahab to gather all of Israel, along with the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah, on the summit of Mount Carmel for a final, decisive confrontation. The slopes of Mount Carmel soon teemed with a nation in suspense. It was a vast, silent assembly, a sea of faces etched with the conflicting emotions of hope, fear, and deeply ingrained apathy. They were a people gathered to witness a spectacle, caught between the imposing retinue of Jezebel's prophets, resplendent in their ceremonial vestments, confident in their numbers and royal patronage, and the solitary, imposing figure of Elijah. Clad in his rough mantle, he stood as a stark monument to a faith they had almost completely abandoned. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that precedes a storm. This was not merely a contest of miracles. It was a courtroom convened on a mountaintop. where the soul of Israel would be placed on the scales, and the entire nation would be called to bear witness to the verdict on their divided loyalties. It was into this charged silence that Elijah's voice boomed, projecting a question that pierced the heart of their collective indecision. He did not begin with a sermon or a prayer, but with a raw, incisive diagnosis of their spiritual sickness. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he cried, his words echoing across the silent assembly. This was the moment of truth, encapsulated in the piercing challenge that would define his legacy. "Até quando vocês vão mancar para os dois lados?" How long will you limp on two crutches? The metaphor was devastatingly accurate. He painted a vivid picture of their spiritual state, a people crippled, unable to walk a straight path, attempting to lean on both the unwavering rock of Yahweh and the hollow reed of Baal. It was a question that exposed the foolishness of their compromise, the exhausting and ultimately impossible task of trying to pledge allegiance to two diametrically opposed masters. Their silence was a confession of their guilt. Following Elijah's challenge, the spectacle began. The prophets of Baal, confident in their numbers and their ecstatic techniques, took center stage. They prepared their bull, laid it upon the wood, and began their ritualistic invocation. Their initial chants were rhythmic, a confident appeal to the Lord of fertility and rain. But as the morning sun climbed higher in the mercilessly clear sky, their prayers grew into a frantic, desperate cacophony. They leaped and danced around their silent altar, a whirlwind of motion that betrayed a growing panic. When their voices failed to produce a response, they resorted to more primal, violent acts, gashing themselves with swords and spears according to their custom, until their blood flowed freely, mingling with the dust on the barren mountaintop. It was a horrifying display of misplaced devotion, a testament to the profound emptiness of a God who could not answer. As the hours wore on and the prophets of Baal collapsed in exhausted, bloodied heaps, Elijah began to taunt them, his words laced with a divine sarcasm that dismantled their theology piece by piece. "Shout louder," he mocked, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Each taunt was a theological dagger, exposing the pathetic limitations of their deity. A God who could be distracted, who could be absent, who could sleep. This was no God at all. Elijah was not merely being cruel. He was performing a public exorcism, cleansing the spiritual imagination of his people by demonstrating the utter absurdity and impotence of the idol that had so completely captivated them. His mockery forced the people to confront the lifelessness of the being to whom they had offered their devotion and their children. Throughout this long, agonizing ordeal, the people of Israel remained passive observers. They watched the frenzied ritual of Baal's prophets and listened to Elijah's sharp rebukes, but they did not participate. Their hearts remained hardened in a state of cautious neutrality, waiting to see which power would prevail. They were a nation of spectators, spiritually paralyzed, unwilling to commit until the evidence was overwhelming. This profound indifference was the very disease Elijah had come to cure. Their silence was not a sign of reverence, but of a deep-seated spiritual lethargy. They had gathered not for worship, but for a contest, their faith reduced to a wager on a supernatural duel. This passivity was the most damning evidence of their spiritual adultery, a silent testament to how far they had strayed from a covenant relationship that demanded their full and passionate participation. Finally, as the time for the evening sacrifice approached, a hush fell over the mountain. Elijah stepped forward, his every movement deliberate and imbued with symbolic meaning. He walked to the ruins of an altar to the Lord, a relic of a time before the national apostasy, and began to repair it. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Jacob, a powerful, tangible sermon reminding the fractured assembly of their true identity as one covenant people under one God. He was not simply building a place for a sacrifice, he was symbolically rebuilding the nation itself. He then dug a trench around the altar and gave a shocking command: drench the sacrifice and the wood with 4 large jars of water. He had them do it a second time and then a third until the water filled the trench, creating a scene of impossible combustion. This was an act of audacious faith, designed to remove all doubt and to ensure that what was to come could only be attributed to the sovereign, all-powerful hand of Yahweh. With the stage set and the nation's heart held in a fragile balance, Elijah stepped toward the waterlogged altar. He did not shout or writhe. His prayer was a stark contrast to the chaotic frenzy that had preceded it. It was a simple, confident appeal to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, a plea for God to reveal himself not for the prophet's vindication, but for the sake of turning the people's hearts back to the covenant. As his final words ascended, the response was instantaneous and terrifying in its majesty. Fire fell from the cloudless sky, not a spark, but a torrent of divine flame. It did not merely ignite the offering, it consumed everything: the bull, the wood, the 12 stones of the altar, the very soil beneath it, and all the water that filled the trench. All were vaporized in a display of absolute, unanswerable power. The collective gasp of the crowd was followed by a wave of prostration as the people fell on their faces, their apathy shattered, crying out in a unified chorus of rediscovered faith: "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Yet, the echoes of this great victory quickly faded, replaced by the grim responsibilities of divine judgment. The fire from heaven was a verdict, and Elijah, as God's instrument, was now tasked with carrying out the sentence. The 450 prophets of Baal were seized, and at the Kishon Brook, Elijah oversaw their execution in accordance with the law of Moses. This was not an act of personal vengeance, but a necessary, brutal surgery to excise the cancerous idolatry that had nearly destroyed the nation. The weight of this action, combined with the immense spiritual and emotional energy expended on the mountain, left an indelible mark on the prophet's soul. He was a conduit for God's power, but he was also a man who felt the crushing burden of his mission. Ascending Carmel once more, he bowed in prayer, interceding for the rain his prophecy had withheld, his servant reporting 7 times until, finally, a cloud the size of a man's hand rose from the sea, promising the end of the long drought. The news of the events on Carmel reached Jezebel not as a testimony of God's power, but as a declaration of war. Enraged by the death of her prophets, she sent a messenger to Elijah with a chilling oath: "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." And here, the great paradox of the prophet is laid bare. The man who had faced down a king and an army of false prophets, who had commanded fire from heaven, now crumbled in fear before the threat of one woman. An overwhelming terror seized him, and he fled for his life, running deep into the wilderness of Judah. He left his servant behind and walked a day's journey alone into the desolate landscape, his spirit mirroring the arid emptiness around him. He collapsed under the shade of a solitary broom tree, his inner world as parched and barren as the desert sand. In this moment of complete human frailty, exhausted and believing his mission to be a failure, Elijah prayed not for deliverance, but for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he whispered to the silent, indifferent sky. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He had reached the absolute end of his own strength. But it was here, in this pit of despair, that God's intervention took a form entirely different from the consuming fire of Carmel. There was no thunderous voice of rebuke. Instead, as he slept, an angel gently touched him, waking him to the sight of bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again, only to be awakened a second time with the same gentle urging, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." This was not the God of spectacle, but the God of tender provision, ministering to the brokenness of his servant with grace and compassion. Strengthened by this divine sustenance, Elijah traveled for 40 days and 40 nights, a symbolic pilgrimage that led him to Horeb, the very mountain where God had established his covenant with Israel through Moses. He sought refuge in a cave, seeking an audience with the God he felt had abandoned him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" the divine voice asked. The prophet poured out his heart, a torrent of self-pity, loneliness, and perceived failure. In response, God commanded him to stand on the mountain. A mighty wind tore through the peaks, shattering rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. An earthquake shook the very foundations of the mountain, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. A fire swept past him, reminiscent of Carmel, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there came a sound of sheer silence, a gentle whisper. This was the true revelation. It was here, in the quiet, that God's presence was most profound, teaching his exhausted prophet that true power is not always in the storm, but in the stillness that restores the soul. The profound revelation at Horeb recalibrated Elijah's mission, but it did not erase the consequences of Israel's deep-seated corruption, personified by its royal house. The divine fire on Carmel had exposed the impotence of Baal, yet the venom of injustice and greed continued to flow from the throne. The inevitable judgment was not postponed, but merely redirected to its source. The catalyst for this final verdict was not a grand theological dispute, but a sordid affair of earthly desire, the vineyard of a man named Naboth. This small plot of land, adjacent to the king's palace in Jezreel, became the stage for the monarchy's ultimate moral collapse. King Ahab coveted the land, a seemingly trivial desire, but Naboth refused to sell, citing the sacred, ancestral inheritance laws of God. This righteous refusal exposed the hollow core of Ahab's power. He, the king, was denied something he wanted, and he sank into a sullen, childish despair, unable to reconcile his royal will with divine law. It was Jezebel who transformed the king's petulant sulking into an act of murderous tyranny, demonstrating the depths of her depravity. Seeing Ahab's weakness as an opportunity to assert her own ruthless principles of power, she orchestrated a conspiracy with chilling efficiency. She wrote letters in the king's name, sealed them with his royal seal, and sent them to the elders of Naboth's city. Her instructions were a perversion of the legal process. Convene a fast, set Naboth in a place of honor, and then have two scoundrels bear false witness, accusing him of cursing both God and the king. The elders, complicit and corrupt, obeyed without question. Naboth was summarily condemned and stoned to death outside the city walls. This was the law of cause and effect in its most brutal form. The idolatry nurtured on Mount Carmel had now borne its predictable fruit in the form of social injustice and the shedding of innocent blood for personal gain. As soon as Ahab rose to take possession of the vineyard he had acquired through murder, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, sending him one last time to confront the king. The prophet met him not in the throne room, but on the very land stolen from Naboth, a divine appointment at the scene of the crime. There, amidst the vines that had cost a man his life, Elijah delivered the unalterable sentence. "This is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours." The judgment was precise, a horrifying echo of the crime itself. The sentence extended to Jezebel, the architect of the evil. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. And for Ahab's entire dynasty, the verdict was annihilation. The judgment was no longer a distant threat or a national calamity. It had become personal, specific, and inescapable. The house of Ahab, which had troubled Israel with its idolatry and injustice, was now marked for utter destruction. Yet, even in the shadow of this grim and unyielding sentence, a subtle shift occurs in the divine narrative, a sliver of light piercing the suffocating darkness of judgment. God's ultimate purpose is never solely destruction. It is the purification and preservation of a covenant people. Having pronounced the doom of Ahab's house, the divine focus turns from the dismantling of the corrupt to the encouragement of the faithful. The story pivots from the thunder of public confrontation to the quiet, almost secret, work of preservation. It is a profound reminder that even when God's judgment is most visible and severe, His work of grace continues, often unseen, in the hearts of those who remain loyal. The fire, the earthquake, and the wind are instruments of judgment, but the future of the nation would be built upon the foundation of the still, small voice and the remnant that chose to listen to it, proving that God's mercy is as sovereign as His wrath. This glimmer of hope was made explicit to Elijah in the cave on Mount Horeb, in the direct aftermath of his deepest despair. His lament, "I am the only one left," was not just a cry of loneliness, but a statement of perceived mission failure. He believed the entire nation had apostatized, that his work had been in vain. It was then that God's quiet whisper corrected his perspective, revealing a truth that would reshape his understanding of divine victory. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel," the Lord declared, "all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." This was not just a statistic. It was a revelation of a hidden, parallel story of faithfulness running concurrently with the public narrative of corruption. For Elijah, this news must have been a balm to his weary soul, a powerful assurance that he was not, and had never been, truly alone. God's kingdom was larger than his own limited vision. Beyond the assurance of a faithful remnant, God provided a tangible plan for the future, a guarantee that the prophetic torch would not be extinguished. The divine command from Horeb included a specific forward-looking instruction: "Anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, to succeed you as prophet." This was God's promise of continuity. The mission was not dependent on Elijah's strength or longevity. It was a divine mandate that would be carried forward. The act of finding Elisha plowing in a field and casting his mantle over him was a profound symbolic transfer. It was a testament to the fact that God's work is never confined to a single individual. The hope for Israel lay not just in the preservation of a remnant, but in the raising up of new leaders, ensuring the voice of truth would continue to challenge, guide, and restore the nation long after its current heroes had passed from the scene. In light of this divine strategy of preservation and succession, the prophet's challenging question is reborn with a new meaning. The phrase, "Até quando vocês vão mancar para os dois lados?" transforms from a scathing indictment into a hopeful invitation. It is no longer just a diagnosis of a crippled nation, but a call to join the steadfast remnant, to find healing and purpose in decisive commitment. The existence of the 7,000 proves that choosing a side is possible. The calling of Elisha proves that there is a future for those who walk a straight path. The question now echoes as a summons out of the wavering, indecisive crowd, urging them to find their footing with the faithful few whose knees have not bent to the spirit of the age. It's a call to stop limping in the twilight of compromise and to stride confidently into the dawning light of God's enduring purpose. The legacy of Elijah is, therefore, a profound and necessary paradox. He is rightfully remembered as the prophet of fire, the solitary figure who called down flames from heaven and single-handedly faced down the corrupt spiritual and political system of his day. His story is etched into history as a testament to the spectacular power of God. Yet the narrative that truly defines him, the story often left untold, is not found on the triumphant summit of Mount Carmel, but under a lonely broom tree in the depths of a desert of despair. His greatest strength was not ultimately revealed in the thunderous confrontation, but in his complete vulnerability, in the raw honesty of his exhaustion and his willingness to listen for God's voice, not in the gale-force wind or the earth-shattering quake, but in the sound of a gentle whisper. This is the great idea of his life. True divine power is often perfected and most clearly understood through the crucible of human weakness and attentive silence. This truth carves a timeless spiritual lesson directly into our modern, often performance-driven lives. We are conditioned to seek and celebrate the Mount Carmel moments, the public victories, the dramatic breakthroughs, the visible evidence of success and divine favor. But Elijah's journey forces us to confront a more profound reality. God is intimately present and powerfully active in the broom tree moments as well. He meets us not only in our strength, but perhaps more profoundly, in our exhaustion, our disillusionment, and our deepest feelings of failure and isolation. The story of Elijah teaches us that ministerial success, professional achievement, or even profound faith does not grant us immunity from human fragility. It is often in the desolate wilderness of our own burnout and despair that God does his most transformative work, sustaining us with his gentle provision and redefining our purpose when we believe our journey is over. This ancient narrative holds up a mirror to our own souls, compelling us to ask uncomfortable questions. What are the modern Baals that demand a place on the altars of our hearts, causing us to limp between the values of God's kingdom and the priorities of our culture? In a world saturated with the constant noise of media, opinions, and distractions, where can we find our own Horeb, a place to intentionally listen for the sound of sheer silence? When we face a spiritual drought in our own lives, a barrenness of soul, are we looking for God to answer with a spectacular fire? Or are we positioning ourselves to hear his gentle whisper of direction and reassurance? Elijah's life challenges us to re-evaluate not only who we worship, but how we listen, reminding us that the most vital divine communications often arrive when we are at our quietest and most broken. Ultimately, the story of Elijah is a powerful declaration of the enduring sovereignty of God, a God whose grand purposes are never thwarted by the burnout of a single servant or the corruption of an entire generation. His plans are not fragile. They do not depend on our unwavering strength, but are fulfilled through his unwavering faithfulness. He always preserves a remnant, he always provides a successor, and he always ensures his covenant promise moves forward. The God who met Elijah in the silence of the cave is the same God who sustains his people through every age, reminding us that even when we feel utterly alone and finished, his work through us and for us is far from over. If this message of a God who meets us in our weakness has touched your heart and offered you hope, please help us spread this truth by liking this video, sharing it with someone who may need it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that reveal the profound heart of God.